So they see it now. They finally see what you've been building in the shadows. Welcome back, you brilliant orchestrators of your own destiny. You misread visionaries. You quiet operators who've been executing at a frequency they couldn't detect. That's right. You, the one they labeled unstable. The one they diagnosed from a distance. The one they swore was unraveling. Strange how perspectives shift when the dust settles, isn't it? Interesting how instability suddenly resembles strategy when they finally glimpse the game you were playing while they were still learning the rules. Let me ask you something. When did you first sense they thought you were losing it? Was it when you disappeared without a word? Was it when you refused to defend yourself anymore? Was it when you made that decision that appeared reckless to everyone else but felt like the only rational move to you? They spiraled, didn't they? Your circle, your relatives, even strangers who barely crossed your path, started theorizing, started analyzing, started making predictions about when you'd implode. But here's the truth they missed. Here's what they couldn't grasp, because they've never operated at your altitude. You weren't surrendering control, you were seizing it. Every action that appeared chaotic was strategic. Every connection you severed, you'd already measured the fallout. Every relationship you ended, you'd already simulated your existence with them still present, and you erased that reality with clinical accuracy. They assumed you were disintegrating, you were integrating. You see, there's a wavelength of awareness that disturbs people because it doesn't broadcast itself. It doesn't display certificates. It doesn't require validation from the masses. It simply acts. And when it acts, it appears insane to minds still attempting to forecast results using the same obsolete algorithms they've been conditioned to trust their entire lives. You abandoned their playbook, and they labeled it a collapse. You initiated your own game, and they labeled it delusion. But delusion and brilliance, they've always shared the same address, haven't they? The only distinction is the outcome when it's all finished. Let's reverse the film. Let's return to that instant, that precise instant when you executed the choice that made everyone doubt your stability. Perhaps you abandoned the position that appeared flawless externally, but was extracting your essence like a gradual toxin. Perhaps you terminated the connection that everyone claimed was so beneficial for you, but felt like suffocating with witnesses. Perhaps you vanished for months without updates, without justifications, without executing the expected digital performance that confirms you're still functioning and engaged. They labeled it unpredictable. They labeled it self-sabotaging. Some of them, the ones who genuinely believed they understood you, they labeled it a plea for rescue with that patronizing sympathy coding their words like they were commentators in your disaster. But you weren't pleading for rescue. You were removing obstacles. You weren't collapsing inward. You were bursting forward. And the most exquisite part, you didn't require them to comprehend. You didn't require their authorization, their approval, or their commentary. Because here's the reality about intentional gambles that cautious people will never grasp. It appears identical to carelessness from the exterior. The individual who leaps without an obvious safety net, and the individual who leaps understanding precisely where they'll arrive, they appear the same in motion. But one of them analyzed the mechanics. One of them calculated the variables in the darkness while everyone else was unconscious, fantasizing limited fantasies in their secure enclosures. You were that individual. You are that individual. And now they're beginning to perceive it. Now the evidence is materializing. Now the existence you're constructing, the identity you've transformed into, the tranquility you're inhabiting, it's irrefutable. And suddenly their melody transforms. Suddenly it wasn't insane. Suddenly it was courageous. Suddenly you weren't careless. You were executing a quantum leap. Suddenly the identical people who doubted your clarity are requesting guidance. requesting how you accomplished it, requesting if you can assist them execute their own radical transformations. But you understand what's genuinely occurring here, don't you? You understand what this acknowledgement actually signifies? It signifies they're finally matching the pace of a conclusion you reached months back, potentially years back. They're finally accessing the realization you discovered while they were still deliberating in their group discussions. They're finally witnessing the projection you possessed when there was nothing except obscurity and your own certainty. And that distance, that temporal distance between when you understood and when they calculated it out, that's the evidence. That's the evidence you were functioning on a separate plane. That's the evidence their worry was simply terror camouflaged as concern. That's the evidence you believed in yourself when you possessed every rational justification not to. And you were accurate. You weren't fortunate. You weren't careless. You weren't insane. You were precise. And being precise before everyone else is what they label brilliance. Even when they're excessively proud to articulate that expression directly to your presence. Let me reveal what genuinely occurred, because they'll never confess this segment. When you executed that action, when you performed that thing that appeared irrational, something within them acknowledged it. Something buried in their subconscious recognized you were accessing something authentic, something genuine, something they didn't possess the bravery to pursue themselves. And that acknowledgement, that momentary spark of what if they're accurate, it petrified them more than anything. Because if you were accurate, if your insanity was actually perception, then what did that transform them into? It transformed them into cowards. It transformed them into participants in their own average existence. It transformed every safe selection they'd executed look like precisely what it was, a capitulation to terror masquerading as maturity. So they needed to transform you into the mistake. They needed to transform you into the warning story. They needed to convert your audacity into a hazard sign so they could rest peacefully in their confinements of ease. But you didn't grant them that gratification, did you? You didn't collapse. You didn't ignite. You didn't return groveling with regrets and confessions that they were accurate all throughout. Instead, you performed something far more destructive. You flourished. You transformed. You became living evidence that the route they were excessively frightened to attempt actually arrived somewhere magnificent. And now they need to exist with that. Now they need to observe you inhabit in a dimension they convinced themselves was unattainable. And here's the segment that genuinely penetrates the wound. You're not even resentful toward them anymore. You're not maintaining grudges. You're not anticipating apologies that will never materialize because somewhere throughout your expedition you comprehended something that altered everything. Their uncertainty was never regarding you. It was perpetually regarding them. Their terror was perpetually their own. Their necessity to label you insane was perpetually their necessity to experience rational in their own stasis. So now when they return, when they appear in your communications with, "Hey, I've been considering you," or "You appear genuinely content," or "Can we communicate?" You perceive it for what it is. It's not reconciliation, it's investigation. They're not monitoring you. They're monitoring if the regulations they've been existing by are actually legitimate, or if you discovered a method to violate them without repercussions. They're examining you now, the method they should have believed in you then. And some of them, the genuinely audacious ones, they'll attempt to reconstruct the past. They'll assert they perpetually supported you. They'll declare they understood you'd resolve it. They'll situate themselves as advocates who were present all throughout, simply quieter than the skeptics. But you recall who was silent, when silence experienced like desertion. You recall who interrogated when you required assurance. You recall who remained and who evacuated when your existence appeared like a catastrophe film to everyone observing. But here's the magnificent segment. Here's the segment that transforms all of it valuable. You don't require them to reconstruct the past because you're excessively occupied constructing the future. You don't require them to confess they were mistaken because you're excessively concentrated on being accurate regarding what materializes next. You don't require their validation now because you discovered to validate yourself when their acceptance was the only currency you assumed you required. Let's discuss the configuration they're beginning to acknowledge, because this isn't the initial time you've executed this, is it? This isn't the initial time you've performed a maneuver that appeared questionable and converted it into something undeniable. You possess a chronicle of this, a portfolio of perceiving around obstacles that haven't been constructed yet, a standing, whether they recognize it or not, for being accurate in methods that require duration to demonstrate. You're the individual who predicted the separation before anyone else detected the fractures. You're the individual who departed the gathering early before it converted into a catastrophe everyone regrets. You're the individual who distanced from possibilities that appeared golden but smelled incorrect, and then observed those possibilities corrode in actual duration. You possess instincts that function faster than their reasoning, and that's perpetually been your advantage and their bewilderment. They process through panels. You process through precision. They require agreement. You require authenticity. They maneuver when it's secure. You maneuver when it's accurate. And that distinction, that fundamental distinction in operating mechanisms, it generates a delay. They're perpetually perceiving your maneuvers in hindsight, dissecting your conclusions after the results are already apparent, questioning how you understood when there was no method to understand. But you did understand. You perpetually understand. Not because you're clairvoyant, not because you're fortunate, but because you've discovered to listen to the wavelength they've silenced. You detect the murmurs underneath the expressions. You perceive the configurations underneath the disorder. You sense the transformations before the foundation starts relocating. They label it intuition, like it's supernatural. You understand it's simply observing at a dimension that most individuals discover draining. And that's why your insanity was intentional, because you were calculating with information they couldn't detect. You were executing formulas that incorporated factors they didn't acknowledge existed. You were resolving for results they couldn't visualize because they'd never permitted themselves to desire something that distant outside the manuscript. Your mathematics appeared like delusion because they couldn't perceive the figures you were calculating with. Now, let's discuss what materializes next, because acknowledgement is simply the commencement. Now that they perceive you were accurate, now that they comprehend your collapse was actually a penetration, they're going to desire something from you. They're going to desire the algorithm. They're going to desire the acceleration. They're going to desire you to convert your instinct into directions they can execute without needing to cultivate that instinct themselves. And here's where you need to be vigilant. Here's where the genuine examination commences, because it's seductive to instruct. It's seductive to clarify. It's seductive to accept every individual who doubted you and convert them into a pupil simply to demonstrate you were perpetually the instructor. But not everyone merits your intelligence. Not everyone has obtained access to your methodology. Some individuals desire your results without your hazard. Some individuals desire your precision without your disorder. You don't owe them the blueprint. You don't owe them the dissection of every conclusion that guided you here. You don't owe them the privilege of comprehending what they decline to believe. Some teachings are only intended for the individuals who discover them in the inferno, not the individuals who materialize after the smoke dissipates, requesting how you endured the combustion. Your narrative is yours. Your methodology is yours. Your delusion, your brilliance, your intentional disorder, it's all yours. But for the ones who were present, for the ones who remained silent when they didn't comprehend but didn't interrogate your clarity, for the ones who granted you atmosphere when you required separation and didn't transform it regarding them, those individuals they acquire to perceive behind the barrier. Those individuals obtain the privilege to understand how you executed it, not because they supported you flawlessly, but because they supported you imperfectly, without attempting to halt you. And here's what you can reveal them. Here's what you can distribute with the individuals who actually merit to understand. You didn't possess a blueprint. You possessed a compass. You didn't execute steps. You executed authenticity. You didn't calculate every result. You calculated the expense of remaining identical and concluded any hazard was superior than that assured death. You didn't understand it would function. You understood executing nothing definitely wouldn't. You believed yourself in the obscurity. You believed your instincts over their counsel. You selected your tranquility over their comprehension. You appreciated your future over their ease. And every time you executed a selection that appeared irrational, you were genuinely executing a selection between two iterations of yourself. The one they desired you to be and the one you required to transform into. You selected yourself every single time. And that selection, that consistent selecting of yourself, even when it appeared selfish, even when it experienced isolated, even when you possess no evidence it would guide anywhere beneficial. That's the brilliance they're acknowledging now. That's the calculation they're finally perceiving. You gambled on yourself when you were the longest probability in the space. You invested in your own projection when no one else could perceive it. You maintained the boundary when everyone else was instructing you to withdraw. Now they desire to understand how you possess that category of conviction. They desire to understand where that assurance originated from. They desire to understand what transformed you so confident when everything appeared so ambiguous. And the response is going to dissatisfy them because it's excessively simple. The response is, you weren't confident. You were dedicated. There's a distinction. Assurance is understanding the result. Dedication is progressing forward without it. You didn't understand it would function. You concluded it needed to. You didn't understand you'd endure. You concluded survival was non-negotiable. You didn't understand you'd succeed. You concluded failing wasn't a possibility you'd contemplate. And that conclusion, that refusal to accept the iteration of your existence where you remained limited, where you executed secure, where you expired gradually in ease. That was the genuine calculation. Let's advance even deeper. Let's discuss the specific instances they labeled insane that you understood were essential. Recall when you terminated explaining yourself, when you simply initiated maneuvering without the mandatory announcement regarding your intentions. They labeled it concealing. They labeled it questionable. Some of them labeled it superior. But you understood something they didn't. You understood that justification weakens implementation. You understood that every time you rationalized your maneuvers to individuals who couldn't perceive your projection, you were granting them weaponry to convince you against it. You understood that their interrogations weren't originating from inquisitiveness, but from terror, and their terror was infectious, so you terminated communicating their dialect. You terminated converting your future into terminology they could comprehend. You permitted your actions to execute the communication, and you permitted duration to execute the instruction. And when you distanced from individuals without resolution, Without the theatrical final discussion, without the organized conclusion they assumed they merited. They labeled it frigid. They labeled it brutal. They declared you vanished like you were the antagonist in their narrative. But you understood something regarding resolution. They didn't. You understood that some entrances don't require to be formally secured. Some entrances simply require to be abandoned while you continue advancing. You understood that the resolution discussion they desired was genuinely simply another attempt to alter your perspective, to cultivate uncertainty, to transform you second-guess the understanding that inhabited in your skeleton. So you refused them that possibility. You safeguarded your conclusion by declining to protect it. You respected your selection by not situating it up for deliberation, and that was brilliance masquerading as frigidity. When you vanished from digital platforms, when you terminated executing your existence for an audience that was observing you like a reality program, they declared you were segregating. They declared you were severing yourself off. They diagnosed you with everything from depression to delusion because you terminated granting them material to absorb, but you were executing something they couldn't grasp. You were recalling who you were before you transformed into a character in everyone else's narrative. You were eliminating the execution. You were terminating the representation. You are discovering the iteration of yourself that existed before you discovered to transform for survival. And that procedure, that brutal, magnificent procedure of unbecoming everything you're not, it requires silence. It requires absence. It requires you to be so unavailable to their narratives that you can finally detect your own voice underneath all the interference. They labeled it insane because your absence transformed them uncomfortable. It transformed them interrogate why they required your presence to validate their own existence. It transformed them question what you were executing in that silence that was so much more significant than maintaining your position in their social ecosystem. And the response they couldn't understand because you weren't executing it, is you were recovering, you were constructing, you were transforming. Now let's address the instant that genuinely bewildered them, the instant you terminated battling. Recall when you used to dispute back, when you used to protect your perspective, rectify their miscomprehensions, demonstrate your position until they possess no selection but to perceive your side, and then one day you simply terminated. You permitted them to assume whatever they desired. You permitted their iteration of occurrences stand uncorrected. You permitted them to be mistaken regarding you in public while you concentrated on being accurate regarding yourself in private. They assumed you'd capitulated. They assumed you'd accepted their narrative. Some of them assumed they'd finally fractured you into compliance. But you hadn't capitulated. You'd transcended. You comprehended that their perspective of you was none of your occupation. You comprehended that protecting yourself to individuals dedicated to miscomprehending you was like attempting to instruct mechanics to a concrete barrier. Possible in theory, meaningless in execution. So you extracted your energy from that combat zone. You terminated battling for your standing in the tribunal of individuals who'd already executed their verdict. You permitted them to possess their mistaken narrative because you were excessively occupied inhabiting the accurate one. And that selective silence, that tactical capitulation of the dispute to succeed the conflict, that was the calculation they confused for defeat. Here's what they're comprehending now, gradually, agonizingly, hesitantly. Every maneuver you executed that appeared like a mistake was actually an examination. You were examining their allegiance, their belief, their capability to support you when support was the only currency that mattered. And they failed. They failed dramatically. They selected the ease of collective agreement over the bravery of individual conviction. They selected the security of doubting you over the hazard of protecting you.